What if the first female serial killer in American history was not a shadowy figure hiding in alleyways, but a beautiful innkeeper who welcomed you in with a smile? What if the bed you slept in was designed not to comfort you, but to bury you? Charleston in the 19th century was a city built on wealth, civility, and polished manners. Yet behind closed doors, travelers vanished, their stories silenced. Why were these whispers buried for so long? Why was her name nearly erased, except in the fearful folklore that refused to die? Tonight we uncover the chilling truth of Lavinia Fisher and the crimes that made her a legend of terror. Charleston in the early 19th century was a city that existed in two distinct layers, each casting its shadow on the other. On the surface, it was a place of elegance and prosperity, where the whir of carriage wheels echoed against cobblestone. Streets and gas lamps bathed the night in a warm, golden glow. Wealth from cotton and rice plantations poured into its port, creating an image of refinement that impressed visitors from around the world. The city's grand homes stood as monuments to Southern gentility, their porches lined with columns, their interiors alive with the scent of magnolia blossoms drifting in through the open shutters. But beneath this polished veneer lay another Charleston entirely, one less spoken of in polite company. It was a city shaped by fear, by whispers of crime and disappearances, by a darkness that seemed to seep in from the marshes and back roads that surrounded it. The year that framed this atmosphere was one of transition, a period in which Charleston teetered between old-world refinement and the chaos that so often simmered on the edges of prosperity. The cobblestone charm that travelers admired was not enough to conceal the realities of poverty, lawlessness, and a swelling undercurrent of violence. For all the formality of its drawing rooms, Charleston's shadows were thick, and in those shadows lived stories that polite society would rather not have heard. Among them was a name that, for some, carried a chill even when whispered: Lavinia Fisher. Before her story captured headlines and ballads, Charleston's reputation as a dangerous place for travelers had already begun to spread. Those who dared to journey the roads leading into the city, especially the stage routes from the countryside, knew the risks. Highwaymen prowled the woods, and boarding houses were not always as safe as they appeared. An innkeeper could be either a savior to the weary or the architect of their ruin, and this uncertainty created a tension that clung to every roadside stop. The polite smile of a host could hide anything: desperation, greed, or something far darker. The atmosphere of Charleston in those years made it fertile ground for rumor, and the Fisher Inn would soon become the center of those whispers. The city itself was caught between a sense of order and the undeniable presence of danger. Law enforcement in the early 1800s was fragmented, often reliant on local vigilantes and citizens' patrols. The wealthy protected their own interests, while the poor were left vulnerable to exploitation. Against this backdrop, crime flourished in the margins. Stolen goods moved in the night. Fences and thieves struck deals under the cover of anonymity, and those who vanished were often simply forgotten. To the respectable families of Charleston, such matters were nuisances they preferred to ignore. But for those who traveled alone, carrying their life savings or personal belongings with them, these dangers were a constant reality. It was within this fragile balance of civility and violence that Lavinia Fisher's story took root. Her presence in Charleston was not that of a shadow lurking in the alleys, but rather a figure in plain view, an innkeeper whose name would soon be tied to the darker side of the city's reputation. She embodied the contradictions of Charleston itself, outwardly graceful yet carrying the weight of something unsettling beneath the surface. Travelers passing through could never have known that in the heart of such a genteel city, danger might present itself not as a masked thief, but as a smiling hostess offering food and rest. The world of 1819 and the years that followed were marked by an unsteady trust in appearances. Respectability meant everything in Charleston's society, and women in particular were expected to uphold the image of morality and domestic virtue. Lavinia's alleged crimes struck deeper because they seemed to shatter this illusion entirely. The idea that a woman, admired for her looks and presence, could be tied to acts of violence so gruesome unsettled not only Charleston, but the broader imagination of America at the time. Female killers were unheard of in a society that romanticized women as nurturers and moral anchors. For this reason, the mention of her name was more than a tale of crime. It was a disruption of everything that Charleston's delicate order wanted to believe about itself. The geography of Charleston also played its role in weaving this dark tale. Surrounded by marshlands and thick woods, the city's approaches were treacherous. Travelers were funneled along narrow roads where danger was easy to hide. Inns and boarding houses served as waypoints, but they were also liminal spaces, places where the rules of society blurred, where a guest's safety relied entirely on the honesty of their host. In this setting, an inn was not just a business. It was a threshold between life and death, trust and betrayal. The Fisher Inn became infamous precisely because it occupied this fragile space. What should have been a refuge instead became the subject of whispered dread. Charleston's economy and class divides deepened the dangers. The wealth that defined the city created an illusion of stability, but that wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. For those outside its golden circle, survival often meant resorting to theft, trickery, or violence. Stories of missing travelers did not alarm the elite in the same way they alarmed those who lived by the roads, for the loss of a merchant or a laborer was not considered a matter worth tarnishing Charleston's refined image. This indifference allowed danger to thrive unchecked, and it allowed the legend of Lavinia Fisher to grow into something larger than life. It was in 1847, years after her execution, that the weight of her story became part of Charleston's darker folklore. The city was no stranger to legends, but hers was different. She was not a phantom born of superstition, but a woman remembered for her defiance on the gallows, for the fear she inspired, and for the mystery that lingered around her supposed crimes. The Charleston of 1847 was still a place of contradictions, still grappling with its dual identity of elegance and menace, and Lavinia's ghost became a fitting emblem of that struggle. The world she inhabited was one in which trust could kill. Appearances deceived and safety was always uncertain. Charleston, with its mix of grandeur and decay, civility and lawlessness, was the perfect stage for her story. The year, the place, and the character were inseparable from one another, woven together in a tapestry that revealed how even the most beautiful facades could conceal unspeakable truths. To speak of Lavinia Fisher was to speak of Charleston itself, a city that offered both welcome and betrayal, light and shadow, a place where the boundaries between safety and danger blurred until no one could be certain what waited behind the next door. Lavinia Fisher was unlike the figures who typically occupied Charleston's dark tales. She was not a thief lurking in the alleys, nor a bandit on horseback. She was a woman who seemed, at least on the surface, to embody the civility and refinement that the city valued. Her beauty was often remarked upon, with descriptions of a woman who carried herself with confidence, whose presence commanded attention in a room. Some called her striking, others unsettling, but no one denied that she had a certain power about her. That power, coupled with the role she played as innkeeper alongside her husband John, gave her a kind of influence over travelers that few suspected could turn deadly. To many, she was America's first female serial killer, though the lines between fact and folklore blur whenever her name is spoken. The world in which she lived had little room for women to occupy positions of notoriety outside of scandal or rumor. Women were expected to be the guardians of virtue, devoted wives and mothers who maintained the image of morality. To accuse a woman of violent crime, let alone of multiple murders, was to rupture a deeply held belief about gender and society. It is for this reason that Lavinia's name carried such a weight of fear and fascination. She was not supposed to exist. She was not supposed to be capable of such acts. Yet the whispers that surrounded her suggested otherwise, and the stories that grew from her reputation made her something far larger than a simple criminal. At the center of her legend was the inn she operated with her husband. To weary travelers, it appeared as a refuge, a place where one might find food, conversation, and a bed to rest in after long hours on the road. But in the retelling of her story, that inn became something more sinister, a stage upon which Lavinia played the role of temptress and executioner. Tales told of her offering guests tea that carried a bitter taste, of her coaxing them to drink, as her husband waited in the shadows. Others spoke of beds that collapsed into hidden pits, swallowing men alive. While historians debate the truth of these accounts, what matters is not only whether they occurred, but how they were believed. The image of Lavinia smiling sweetly as she handed a poisoned cup or gestured toward a bed prepared for death has seared itself into Charleston's folklore. Part of what made her story endure was the contrast between her outward appearance and the darkness she was accused of embodying. Accounts describe her as elegant, poised, with an air that suggested intelligence and composure. Unlike the brutish criminals who dominated Charleston's backroads, Lavinia was refined, educated in manners if not in books, and capable of disarming suspicion with charm. To imagine her as a killer was to confront the unsettling truth that danger does not always wear a face we expect. She was, in essence, the perfect predator for her time, one who could lure victims not through force but through hospitality. Her relationship with John Fisher added another layer to her story. The two were inseparable in reputation, both accused of running a criminal operation together. Yet it was Lavinia who captured the imagination of the public far more than John ever could. Where John was seen as a partner in crime, Lavinia was cast as the mastermind, the figure who orchestrated the horror with a chilling sense of calculation. This perception may have been shaped by the cultural shock of a woman acting outside of societal expectations. A man running a violent scheme was tragic but believable. A woman at the center of it was unthinkable, and therefore unforgettable. When Lavinia was finally brought to trial, it was not merely a question of guilt or innocence, but a spectacle that challenged the community's very understanding of morality. Witnesses painted pictures of her offering poisoned drinks, of travelers disappearing without a trace after her hospitality. Even those who could not provide direct evidence spoke of her coldness, her lack of remorse, and the unsettling aura she projected. These testimonies blurred the line between fact and legend, but they cemented her identity in the public mind as someone beyond redemption. The court may have sentenced her for crimes of theft and assault, but in the collective imagination she was already something worse. A murderer of countless men, a female face of evil. The way she carried herself at her execution only reinforced this reputation. Instead of cowering, instead of pleading for forgiveness, Lavinia stood before the crowd in a wedding dress, her composure unbroken. She refused to show fear when she uttered her infamous last words, inviting the crowd to give her a message to carry to hell. She ensured that her story would live far beyond the gallows. She was not just a criminal dying for her crimes. She was a figure who embraced her legend, who leaned into the role of villain and left Charleston with a final performance no one could forget. In this sense, Lavinia Fisher became more than a historical figure. She became a symbol, a myth woven into Charleston's identity. Her name was spoken not only in courtrooms but in taverns, in stories told by travelers who warned each other of the dangers lurking behind seemingly kind faces. Parents told their children her story as a cautionary tale, and over time, her legend transformed. Whether or not she truly poisoned her guests or built trapdoors beneath her inn mattered less than the fact that people believed she had. In the collective imagination, she was the embodiment of betrayal, the woman who turned hospitality into horror, who transformed trust into death. The centrality of Lavinia in these tales speaks to something deeper about society's fears. She represented the inversion of expected roles, the corruption of femininity itself. In a time when women were viewed as symbols of purity and order, the idea of one wielding violence so coldly unsettled the foundations of belief. She was not just a killer, she was a distortion of everything a woman was supposed to be. This is why her legend endures, why her name is still whispered in Charleston centuries later. The story of Lavinia Fisher is therefore not only about one woman accused of terrible crimes. It is also about how a community, and eventually a nation, grappled with the possibility that evil could wear a beautiful face, that violence could live behind refined manners, that the person offering you comfort could be the one plotting your death. In this way, she became a mirror for Charleston itself, an elegant city with shadows hidden beneath its polished surface, a place where appearances deceived and darkness lurked just beneath civility's thin veil. The inn that Lavinia and John Fisher operated was no ordinary roadside establishment. To those who passed through Charleston in the early 19th century, inns and boarding houses were more than just places to sleep. They were sanctuaries along perilous roads, lifelines in a world where travel was slow, exhausting, and fraught with danger. For weary travelers, a bed offered safety, food promised strength, and a welcoming smile eased the anxiety of isolation. The Fisher Inn, perched along a busy route leading into Charleston, seemed at first to provide all of this. Guests could expect to find Lavinia greeting them with warmth, her appearance polished, her voice soft enough to disarm suspicion. The atmosphere she and John created was convincing, even comforting. Yet, as the stories go, this house of refuge was in truth a house of doom, a carefully constructed snare where the vulnerable became prey. The whispers surrounding the inn did not arise overnight. At first there were just small questions. Travelers who had lodged with the Fishers were not heard from again. Letters sent by family members went unanswered, and business contacts wondered why men had failed to arrive at their destinations. In an age without rapid communication, such disappearances could be explained away as robbery on the roads or accidents in the wilderness. But when the tally of missing persons grew, attention began to turn toward the one constant in their journeys: the Fisher Inn. The accounts that circulated were chilling. One story described Lavinia welcoming her guests with charm, coaxing them into comfort with tea or supper. The tea, some said, carried an unfamiliar bitterness, a taste that lingered uneasily on the tongue. Those who drank it often felt drowsy, overcome with fatigue, and retired to their rooms without resistance. Another version of the tale claimed that Lavinia and John had devised a mechanical bed, rigged so that at the pull of a lever it would collapse, plunging its occupant into a pit below. Whether poisoned or trapped, the guest would find themselves utterly defenseless. From there, what awaited them depended on who told the story. Some claimed the victims were robbed and beaten, their bodies discarded into the woods. Others whispered that far worse fates awaited them: death by suffocation, strangulation, or burial alive. What makes these stories compelling is not only their grotesque detail, but the way they reflect the deepest fears of travelers. A roadside inn was supposed to be a refuge, but what if it was the most dangerous place of all? A stranger could be robbed by highwaymen, yes, but to be murdered in one's sleep by a host who had seemed so gracious was something far more terrifying. It meant that the very institutions meant to protect the vulnerable could betray them in the cruelest way possible. The Fisher Inn's reputation grew darker as more survivors came forward with their accounts. One man claimed he had been offered tea that made him suspicious. Pretending to drink, he poured it out when Lavinia was not watching. That night, he lay in bed but refused to fall asleep. In the silence, he heard the creak of wood, the slow shifting of weight beneath him, and then a sudden jolt. The bed collapsed, dropping him toward a pit. By sheer luck, he managed to cling to the frame, dragging himself out before he was lost to the darkness below. Stumbling into the night, he escaped, later telling others of the trap that nearly claimed his life. Whether his story was embroidered over time is impossible to say, but it became one of the most enduring pieces of the Fisher legend. The inn itself became a character in these tales, a place where walls whispered betrayal and beds conspired against their occupants. For those who heard the rumors, it was not just another lodging house, but a cursed building, a place where hospitality was nothing more than a mask for murder. Some said that travelers could feel the unease the moment they crossed its threshold, as though the air inside carried a heavy weight. Others described it as deceptively ordinary, the kind of house one might pass without a second glance, which only made the horrors attributed to it more frightening. The familiarity of its facade clashed violently with the crimes whispered about within. Historians, of course, have long debated whether these gruesome details ever truly occurred. Some argue that the stories of poisoned tea and collapsing beds were born from rumor, exaggerations created by frightened communities seeking to explain disappearances that could have had many causes. Yet even if the accounts were embellished, they carried with them the weight of collective fear. In a city where people vanished without answers, the Fisher Inn became a focal point, a way to give shape to terror that otherwise remained faceless. The truth, then, may lie somewhere between fact and legend. Perhaps Lavinia and John were guilty of robbery, violence, even murder, but it was the imagination of the people that transformed their inn into a theater of horror. Regardless of where truth ended and myth began, the inn's reputation sealed Lavinia's fate. When authorities and vigilantes finally descended upon it, they claimed to find stolen goods, belongings that could be traced back to missing travelers. The material evidence was enough to condemn the Fishers, but it was the testimony about the inn's sinister design that etched their names into history. People did not want to believe they had stumbled into the hands of mere thieves. They believed they had entered a trap designed by monsters in human form. The Fisher Inn lingered in Charleston's memory long after it was dismantled. It became more than a building. It was a symbol, a warning told to children and travelers alike. Do not trust the smile of a stranger. Do not drink from the hand that offers too eagerly. And do not sleep too soundly in a place you do not know. Its image merged with Lavinia herself, so that she and the inn became inseparable in legend. She was the hostess who smiled as the poison slipped into the cup, the woman who gestured toward the bed, prepared not for comfort, but for death. In the retelling, the Fisher Inn transcended its physical structure and became a kind of archetype, the embodiment of betrayal hidden within hospitality. It lived on not just in Charleston's folklore, but in the imagination of a nation slowly coming to terms with the idea that danger could wear any face, occupy any space, and that even the most welcoming home could conceal a predator waiting in silence. The stories of Lavinia Fisher's methods have always been the most haunting part of her legend. They carried with them a detail so vivid and unsettling that they felt designed to terrify anyone who dared to travel alone through Charleston's outskirts. Whether or not they were true, they became inseparable from her name, woven into every retelling like a sinister refrain. The most enduring of these stories centered on T. Lavinia, with her refined presence and disarming smile, was said to welcome guests into her inn with warmth, offering them a cup of steaming tea to soothe their weariness after a long day's journey. Hospitality was expected of an innkeeper, but in this case it was alleged to be a mask for cruelty. According to witnesses, the tea often had a bitter taste, sharp and unnatural, a taste that some recognized too late as poison. For those who drank deeply, drowsiness would follow. Limbs would grow heavy, vision would blur, and soon the victim would find themselves unable to resist sleep. In a world where trust in one's host was sacred, the idea that a simple drink could betray you was terrifying, and this detail became one of the hallmarks of her legend. Yet the poisoned tea was only the beginning of the whispers. The inn itself was said to have been transformed into a trap. Guests were shown to their rooms, led to beds that appeared comfortable, sturdy, and safe. But the rumors insisted these beds were not what they seemed. Hidden mechanisms, some said, allowed the beds to collapse at will, opening into pits beneath the floorboards. The unlucky victim, half asleep and weakened by the poison, would be hurled downward into darkness. Whether those pits contained sharpened stakes, suffocating enclosures, or simply a place to leave the victim helpless, the stories varied. But the horror of it was the same. The bed, a universal symbol of rest and safety, became the very instrument of betrayal. To close one's eyes in the Fisher Inn was, according to legend, to surrender one's life. These methods, whether rooted in fact or folklore, carried an eerie theatricality that set them apart from ordinary crime. Highwaymen robbed with pistols, bandits killed with knives, but Lavinia's methods suggested calculation, invention, and almost a cruel artistry. To offer poisoned tea required planning. To design collapsing beds required engineering. These were not impulsive acts of violence, but deliberate performances, carefully staged to ensnare unsuspecting travelers. This is perhaps why the stories spread with such intensity. They felt too elaborate to be invented, too horrifying to be dismissed. They played upon universal fears, the betrayal of trust, the loss of control, the violation of the spaces we consider safest. Survivors' accounts fed these tales. One man, as the story goes, noticed something unusual in the taste of his tea. Pretending to drink, he poured it away while Lavinia's back was turned. Later, lying awake in his room, he claimed to hear creaks and groans beneath the bed frame, as if something were shifting just below him. Sensing danger, He fled into the night, narrowly avoiding what he believed to be a trap waiting to claim him. Stories like this, whether entirely true or exaggerated in retelling, gave shape to the dread surrounding the inn. They offered a glimpse of how close others had come to death, and they painted Lavinia not just as a criminal but as a predator who delighted in the art of deception. The methods attributed to her also reflected a kind of symbolic inversion. Tea, in Charleston society, was associated with refinement, gentility, and domestic comfort. To poison tea was to corrupt the very emblem of civility. The bed, likewise, was the ultimate symbol of safety and rest. To transform it into a mechanism of death was to violate the most intimate of human experiences. The horror lay not only in the physical act but in what it represented, a turning upside down of all that was familiar and safe. It was not merely violence but betrayal at its deepest level, and betrayal has always carried a fear greater than brute force. Historians have long debated how much truth lies in these tales. Some argue that the poisoned tea and collapsing beds were fabrications, legends that grew in the retelling of Lavinia's story. The reality, they suggest, may have been more ordinary: robbery, intimidation, and violence committed against travelers who carried valuables. But even if the details were invented, they persisted because they spoke to the anxieties of the time. Charleston's roads were dangerous, and travelers were vulnerable. Rumors about elaborate methods of murder reflected the fear of helplessness, the dread that one could be betrayed not by a bandit on the road but by the very people trusted to provide safety. The possibility that Lavinia and John Fisher truly devised such methods cannot be dismissed entirely. Evidence recovered at the inn reportedly included stolen goods, belongings tied to missing men. Witnesses testified to strange occurrences, to being urged by Lavinia to drink tea that seemed unusual, to hearing of travelers who never emerged again. Whether these accounts were distorted over time or recorded faithfully, they gave shape to the image of the Fishers as more than mere thieves. They became figures of terror, accused not only of crime but of invention, of turning everyday objects into weapons. The fascination with Lavinia's methods has endured because they feel like the blueprint of later horror stories. They embody the archetypal fears that storytellers return to again and again: the poisoned chalice, the treacherous bed, the trap door leading into oblivion. Her legend reads almost like a Gothic tale, with its sinister inn, its deceptive hostess, its unsuspecting guests lured to doom. Whether or not she truly employed such methods, the persistence of these details shows how deeply they resonated with the imagination of her time and beyond. The poisoned tea, the collapsing beds, the vanishing guests, all of these elements combined to create a story that blurred the line between history and folklore. They turned Lavinia into more than just a criminal. They made her a symbol of treachery, a figure whose crimes carried a theatrical cruelty that ensured her name would never be forgotten. The inn itself became infamous not because of what was proven but because of what was whispered, that every cup, every bed, every smile might conceal death. And so, the legend of Lavinia Fisher's methods endures as one of the most chilling chapters in America's early criminal history. A story where the tools of comfort became instruments of horror and trust itself became the deadliest trap of all. The night did not easily release Charleston from its grip, and when whispers of Lavinia Fisher's inn began to reach the city streets, they carried a venom of their own. People spoke in hushed tones, careful not to let her name escape their lips too freely, as though even uttering it might summon her ghost. The Fisher Inn, once a beacon for weary travelers, had become something more sinister in memory. A place where kindness was just a mask, and hospitality became a weapon. The inn's reputation spread like wildfire, carried by frightened survivors, the families of the disappeared, and by the townsfolk who swore they had seen guests enter its doors only never to return. Rumor and truth intertwined so tightly that no one could pull them apart, and perhaps that was the very essence of Lavinia's chilling legacy, the inability to know where fact ended and terror began. The image of her standing at the threshold, smiling with the charm of a gracious hostess, became burned into the collective imagination of Charleston. People claimed she had a way of looking at strangers that made them feel both welcome and uneasy, a warmth laced with something predatory. Women described her as striking, even beautiful in a sharp and intimidating way, while men spoke of her charisma, the kind that disarmed you before you realized you should have kept your guard. That dissonance became the foundation of the stories. How someone who appeared so kind, so gracious, could at the same time harbor the darkest of intentions. The inn's parlor, once filled with chatter and clinking glasses, was retold in story after story as a trap, a carefully staged setting where Lavinia and her husband lured in their prey. It wasn't long before whispers morphed into accusations. Local farmers muttered about missing livestock, about men who went on journeys through the countryside and vanished without explanation. When questions were asked about where these men had last been seen, the answer often led back to the Fisher Inn. And with each retelling, the inn became less a place of rest and more a house of dread. The rumor that she poisoned her guests' tea became nearly universal, the notion that she would smile sweetly as she handed them a steaming cup, watching as the liquid worked its way through their veins until they grew weak and defenseless. For some, the story went further. They said the very bed where travelers slept was rigged with a trap door, collapsing beneath their weight and plunging them into the basement where John Fisher awaited, knife in hand. Whether true or not, the power of these stories was in how they spread. People began to speak of the inn as though it were alive, a predatory creature with a pulse of its own, feeding on the unsuspecting. To pass it on the road was to feel a chill crawl up your spine, as though the shadows in the windows watched you even in daylight. Travelers who had no choice but to stay there prayed silently that they would make it through the night, and those who survived claimed that something about the place, the silence of the halls, the strange way the floor creaked, the flickering of lantern light, seeped into their bones. Yet, with every rumor, Lavinia's power seemed to grow. The stories did not weaken her. They transformed her into a legend while she was still alive. Children were warned not to misbehave, lest Lavinia Fisher get them. Merchants used her name in threats and curses. Charleston became divided between those who believed her guilty of unspeakable horrors and those who whispered that she had been slandered by jealous rivals and fearful men unwilling to accept a strong-willed woman running her own enterprise on the edge of town. Her beauty and presence gave the rumors more fuel. She was painted as both a witch and a seductress, a woman who could not possibly be ordinary. When the law finally came for her, dragging both Lavinia and John Fisher into custody, the tales did not stop. If anything, they multiplied. Witnesses came forward, recounting how they had been offered food and drink at the inn and felt themselves grow faint, or how they had seen others collapse suddenly in Lavinia's presence. The story of the trapdoor bed was retold so often that it became cemented in Charleston's memory, even though evidence for it remained scarce. The inn was raided, searched, and rumors only deepened when lawmen reported finding stolen goods, personal belongings of travelers whose fates remained unknown. To the frightened citizens of Charleston, this was confirmation enough. The Fishers had built their lives upon blood. Lavinia's trial was less about legal procedure and more about public spectacle. Crowds gathered to see her, not just to hear testimony, but to catch a glimpse of the infamous woman whose name had become synonymous with dread. She sat in the courtroom with a composure that unsettled the public further. Some said she sneered at the proceedings, others that she seemed bored, as though certain that no jury would dare convict her. And yet the stories outside those walls were louder than any testimony. Charleston had already decided her fate long before the verdict was read. The verdict, guilty of highway robbery, a capital crime at the time, was enough to seal her destiny. But to the people of Charleston, the crime of robbery was a mere pretext. In their minds, she was guilty of far darker things. As her execution date loomed, the city swelled with anticipation. They whispered of what she might say in her final moments, what confessions she might make, whether she would at last reveal the true extent of the horrors inside her inn. The day of her execution, thousands gathered, not just for justice, but for the legend that had taken root in their imaginations. Her death was as theatrical as her life. Standing at the gallows, she did not cower or beg forgiveness. Instead, she spoke with a defiance that shocked those who expected tears or repentance. Accounts claim she addressed the crowd with a chilling declaration, warning them that if they had a message for the devil, she would deliver it herself. That final statement solidified her place in history, sealing her fate not only in death but in memory. Lavinia Fisher, whether guilty of murder or not, became Charleston's ghost story, its whispered nightmare, the woman whose name ensured sleepless nights long after the inn itself had crumbled. Long after the trial and execution, the legacy of Lavinia Fisher continued to grow. Her story was told in taverns, in the marketplace, in quiet fireside conversations when the night grew heavy. Tourists came searching for the remnants of her inn, hoping to glimpse the shadows where so many had allegedly perished. And still, no one could truly say what was fact and what was embellishment. That uncertainty became her power, her life. Woven into legend, her crimes, real or imagined, kept alive by fear. It is this enduring reputation, this strange mixture of reality and myth, that makes Lavinia Fisher not merely a criminal of her time, but a figure of timeless fascination. Whether she truly poisoned guests, whether the trapdoor bed ever existed, whether she was as guilty as Charleston believed, these questions remain unanswered. And perhaps that is the point. For sometimes the legend becomes stronger than the truth, and in Lavinia's case, the legend has never stopped breathing. Charleston in the early 1800s carried with it an air of uneasy elegance, a city built on wealth, trade, and the genteel culture of the South, but also scarred by the shadows of slavery, inequality, and a justice system that served the powerful more faithfully than it did the ordinary man. Against this backdrop, Lavinia Fisher's story unfolded, not merely as the tale of a woman accused of crimes, but as a test of how far public fear and collective rumor could bend the law until it snapped under the weight of spectacle. Her trial, unlike any Charleston had seen before, was not just a legal proceeding. It became theater, morality play, and a warning all in one. And within that trial lay the deepest mystery of all. Was Lavinia Fisher truly guilty of the monstrous crimes etched into her name? Or was she the victim of a system desperate to make an example her reputation twisted into legend by whispers, louder than fact. The arrest of Lavinia and her husband John had stirred Charleston into a frenzy. Newspapers had already painted them as highway robbers, as innkeepers luring travelers into traps, and in Lavinia's case, as something even darker, a woman who broke the natural order by embracing violence, treachery, and blood. By the time she was brought into court, her guilt was already assumed in the minds of many. But what made her case unusual was not just the alleged crimes themselves. It was how the proceedings against her seemed more designed to satisfy the hunger for a tale of horror than to uncover the truth. Witnesses came forward, their stories full of terror, but often lacking the hard evidence that law demanded. Men claimed to have escaped her poisoned tea. Others swore they had seen her face in the shadows just before ambushes on lonely roads. Each testimony added to the fog of legend, building an image of Lavinia as less a woman than a phantom of dread that stalked Charleston's nights. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, the spectators filling benches as though attending a performance. The jurors, drawn from the community, were not immune to the rumors that had gripped the city, and they sat with the weight of that knowledge pressing against every word spoken. The prosecutors painted Lavinia with broad strokes. Not only was she an accomplice to her husband's supposed robberies, but she had gone further, seducing travelers into lowering their guard, pouring them tea that numbed their senses, and overseeing their destruction. The narrative was chilling, but as it was told, cracks appeared. No bodies were ever presented, no direct evidence of poison was found, and no single moment tied Lavinia definitively to the crimes. Yet the absence of proof seemed almost irrelevant in the court of public opinion. The people wanted a monster, and the state appeared ready to give them one. The defense, on the other hand, struggled in vain to counter the tide. Lavinia's lawyers argued that hearsay and rumor had taken the place of evidence, that the supposed victims offered conflicting details, and that no traveler had been found buried on the Fishers' land. But in Charleston's fevered climate, their words fell like pebbles against a storm. The trial became less about guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and more about morality itself, what it meant for a woman, a wife, to be cast in the role of predator, and whether society could afford to let such a figure live. At a time when women were expected to embody virtue and obedience, Lavinia's defiance and sharp tongue during the trial only deepened the sense that she was unnatural, dangerous, a witch in human skin. Her refusal to bow, her proud demeanor, in court, became damning evidence in the minds of many who watched. Charleston's newspapers fanned the flames with daily reports, their words dripping with sensationalism. They wrote of Lavinia's cold beauty, her unrepentant stares, her wicked intelligence. They transformed her into a character larger than life, a symbol of the dangers lurking on the fringes of polite society. Every retelling made her more sinister, and soon she was no longer merely accused of robbery or attempted murder, but whispered about as a serial killer whose victims could never be counted because their bones lay scattered in unmarked graves. The fact that no such graves were ever produced mattered little. The absence itself seemed to fuel imagination, as though the Fishers had been too cunning to leave behind evidence. It was in this way that the trial ceased to be about Lavinia Fisher, the person, and became about Lavinia Fisher, the legend, an entity molded by fear. One of the most telling aspects of her trial was the way witnesses described her presence. Men spoke of her charm, how she greeted them with warmth at the inn, how her eyes seemed to watch them with an intensity that unsettled even as it enticed. When these same men later recounted feelings of dizziness or disorientation after drinking her tea, the court accepted their accounts as near proof, though no analysis of the substance was ever conducted. Others testified that they had heard screams in the night near the Fishers' Inn, though they could never identify who screamed or why. Each story was woven into a narrative that felt undeniable, not because it was solid, but because it aligned with what the people already believed, that something dark had been happening at 6 Mile Wayfarer House, and that Lavinia Fisher was at its center. The law, in theory, should have demanded precision. It should have required evidence, consistency, and a burden of proof that shielded the accused from mere rumor. But in practice, the law in Charleston bent beneath the pressure of public outrage. The Fishers were already judged in the hearts of their neighbors, and the trial served as the final act in a drama that had begun long before the first gavel struck. Even when inconsistencies arose, when a witness faltered in recollection, when details failed to align, the momentum of fear carried the trial forward. The jury, after hearing the charges, deliberated quickly, sealing the fate of Lavinia and her husband with a swiftness that spoke less of certainty and more of inevitability. In what was at the end, Lavinia was condemned to hang, not solely because of what she had done, but because of what she represented. To Charleston, she symbolized the collapse of order, the threat that evil could wear the face of a woman and operate in the very heart of society. To many, her defiance in court, her lack of submission, only confirmed her guilt. The trial, far from being a search for truth, was a ritual of control, a way for the city to exercise its fears by casting her as the embodiment of them. And when the verdict was read, the crowd that had gathered erupted not with solemn reflection, but with something closer to satisfaction. Justice in their eyes had been served, though history would remember the proceedings as a murky fusion of fact and legend. The trial of Lavinia Fisher was less about the evidence presented than the story it told, and that story, of poisoned tea, midnight screams, and a woman who defied the roles assigned to her, was more powerful than any fact could be. It etched itself into Charleston's history, shaping not only her fate but the way the city saw itself in the mirror of fear. In that courtroom, truth and myth became indistinguishable, and the woman who may have been guilty of no more than highway robbery was immortalized as America's first female serial killer, condemned not just by the law, but by the legend her trial created. Every story of darkness has its final act, and for Lavinia Fisher, that act was written not with subtlety, but with spectacle. Charleston in 1820 had grown weary of whispers, of shadows cast across its cobblestone streets, of bodies found and bodies rumored. For too long the city had tolerated what lingered just outside its gates, but now the law, the clergy, and the ordinary people demanded resolution. It was no longer enough to suspect Lavinia Fisher of murder. It was time to make her pay for it. Yet in the way she faced judgment, one finds not the quiet submission of guilt, but the defiance of someone who knew she had become more than a woman, more than a criminal. She had become a legend in her own time, and even as the rope awaited her, Lavinia seemed determined to shape how history would remember her. The trial was unlike anything Charleston had seen before. The courtroom, usually reserved for disputes over land or inheritance, was transformed into a theater of accusation and fear. Men who claimed to have narrowly escaped the 6 Mile Wayfarer house came forward, their words trembling but firm. They described how they were welcomed with food, how Lavinia's soft words disarmed them, how they were lulled into trusting her before being served a poisoned cup of tea or directed to sleep in a bed built to murder. Some spoke of trapdoors, of being awakened by a sudden drop into a dark pit below, where hands, whether John Fisher's or accomplices, would finish the work that poison began. Though evidence was circumstantial, the weight of so many voices pressing forward created the atmosphere of certainty. To the jury, it was not just about proving Lavinia's guilt beyond all doubt. It was about protecting Charleston from whatever malevolent influence she represented. The testimony that swayed many was that of David Ross, who recounted how he narrowly escaped the clutches of the Fishers after a night at the inn. His description painted Lavinia as something more sinister than an ordinary criminal. He told the court of her calm gaze, the way she carried herself like a lady of refinement, and yet how beneath that exterior there was calculation in every gesture. The way she poured his tea, the way she insisted he drink, the way she seemed to linger by the door after he refused. It was not the behavior of a woman bound by domestic duty, but of someone conducting an experiment. Ross's survival was not only his own salvation, but became the city's evidence. Proof that the smiling hostess of the 6-Mile House was capable of orchestrating death with the grace of a hostess arranging flowers. But as damning as the words of men like Ross were, they could never compete with the spectacle of Lavinia herself. Unlike John, who sat quietly through most of the proceedings, she was unafraid to confront her accusers. Her voice carried across the courtroom, sharp, cutting, and at times mocking. She denied the accusations, but not with meek protestations of innocence. Instead, she accused the city of envy, of cowardice, of needing a monster to burn so they might distract themselves from their own corruption. In her words, Charleston had condemned her long before she entered that courtroom, and the trial was nothing more than a formality, a ritual to dress up vengeance in the costume of law. Every sentence she uttered was a provocation, designed not merely to clear her name, but to unsettle those who believed themselves righteous. The verdict was never in doubt. Both Lavinia and John Fisher were found guilty of highway robbery, a capital offense at the time, and with it came the sentence of death. But for Lavinia, the gallows became more than a place of punishment. It became a stage. As the day of execution drew near, the city gathered with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for festivals. Children were hoisted on shoulders, merchants closed their shops, clergymen prepared to deliver sermons of justice fulfilled. Yet for all the preparation, no one could have predicted the way Lavinia would seize control of her own ending. On the morning of February 18, 1820, she was led to the gallows dressed in a white wedding gown. To some it was a mockery of the sanctity of marriage and death alike. To others it was a symbol of innocence, a statement that she would not bow to the world's judgment. As the hangman adjusted the rope, Lavinia refused to face the crowd with silence. Instead, she raised her voice, unbroken and fierce, declaring, "If you have a message for the devil, tell me now, for I shall be seeing him shortly." The words struck like thunder, a blasphemy uttered in daylight before God and man alike. Mothers shielded their children's ears, while others gasped or murmured prayers. Yet many could not look away. In that moment, Lavinia did what she had always done. She commanded attention, turned fear into fascination, and left Charleston trembling between horror and awe. Her body fell, but her legend did not. The story of Lavinia Fisher spread quickly, carried by sailors to distant ports, by travelers who embellished the tale with every retelling. Some claimed she had killed dozens, others insisted she had been wrongly accused. a victim of hysteria and the need for a scapegoat. Over time, her image warped into myth. The first female serial killer in America, a ghost who lingered near the old city jail, a woman who struck bargains with the devil himself. Charleston could hang her body, but it could not hang the story she had become. Even today, the name Lavinia Fisher is spoken in tones of unease. Guides leading tours through Charleston's haunted sites point to the old jail and say her spirit remains, pacing the corridors, her white dress still gleaming in the dark. Some visitors claim to have seen her at windows. Others swear they hear her voice mocking them, echoing from the stone walls. Whether these are tricks of imagination or something more, the fact remains that her story has never died. The city that once condemned her now profits from her ghost. And in that strange irony, one wonders whether Lavinia, in the end, had the last word. If you've stayed with us through this journey into Charleston's darkest corners, you now carry a story most were never meant to hear. Lavinia Fisher's tale is not just about crime. It's about how legends are born, how whispers become warnings, and how history can be reshaped by fear. And yet her name still lingers in shadows, spoken like a curse in old taverns and ghost tours of the South. But what do you think? Was she truly America's first female serial killer, or simply a woman swallowed by rumor, punished more for her defiance than her deeds? This is where your voice matters. Tell us what you believe in the comments. Was Lavinia a cold-blooded murderer or a victim of her time? Do you think Charleston's gallows silenced a killer or created a legend? If you found yourself pulled into this story, if you felt the unease in the creaking halls of the 6-mile Wayfarer house, or the weight of the rope at the gallows, then join us as we continue to unearth more secrets that history tried to bury. There are darker stories waiting in forgotten corners, and each one will make you question what you thought you knew. So subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even stranger, even darker, and even harder to forget. And if you dare, leave a comment below. Your thoughts may shape the next mystery we bring into the light.